The focus of this lesson will be on using supplementary angles in order to write triangles proofs. Before we jump into the first example, let's talk a little bit about supplementary angles first of all. Remember, supplementary angles are two angles that add up to 180 degrees. So if I think about what this looks like in a picture, angles 1 and 2 would be supplementary angles because they form a linear pair and add up to 180 degrees. Likewise, angles 3 and 4 would be supplementary angles because they too form a linear pair and add up to 180 degrees. And let's just suppose for a minute that we knew that angle 1 was congruent to angle 3. Are there any other angles in that picture that you would know are congruent? Well, sure, you would say that because angles 1 and 3 are congruent, angles 2 and 4 have to be congruent as well because they're the supplements to those angles. And that's exactly what the congruent supplements theorem says. The congruent supplements theorem says that when you have two angles that are congruent, their supplements are also congruent. Another way you might say this is to say congruent angles have congruent supplements. Or in other words, going back to my picture, because angles 1 and 3 are congruent, their supplements, angles 2 and 4, have to be congruent as well. So you might see this written one of three ways in your proof. You might see it written congruent supplements theorem. You might see when two angles are congruent, their supplements are congruent. Or you might see congruent angles have congruent supplements. All three of those ways talk about congruence and supplements. Those are going to be the important pieces that we're going to have to write about in our proof. All right, I know you're ready, so let's go ahead and let's see what this would look like in a proof. In this first example, we're given that segment AP is congruent to segment CP. So let me go ahead and mark those in my picture. We're told that angles X and Y are congruent, so let me go ahead and mark those in our diagram. And we're told that points B, P, and D all lie on the same line segment. And I can tell that just by looking from the picture. So that third given really isn't helpful or useful. There's no way to really mark that in the picture. So at this point, I'm ready to go ahead and use my picture now to find any pairs of vertical angles. When I look in the picture for vertical angles, I don't see any. I'm ready to look in the picture for shared sides using the reflexive property. And if I look at these two triangles, I see that segment BP is shared between the two triangles, so I'm going to go ahead and mark that with the X. And now the third piece that we're going to add to our repertoire that we can get from the picture are those supplementary angles. And notice that those red angles, X and Y, live outside the triangle. But the important piece here is that their supplements live inside the triangles. And I'm going to call those angles 1 and 2 just so that I have somebody to talk about. So when I look at the picture now, if my mission is to prove triangle APB congruent to triangle CPB, which it is, I can look at that picture and I can prove those triangles are congruent, it looks like, by side, angle, side. So my plan is to use side, angle, side, with my first pair of sides being the reflexive property pair, my pair of angles being those supplements at 1 and 2, and my third pair being the given pair AP congruent to CP. All right, so now that we have a plan, let's go ahead and let's write our proof. Statement 1, we have to talk or The first piece that we have to talk about here is the fact that BP is congruent to itself. Well, I know that BP is congruent to itself because of the reflexive property. So that's a pretty straightforward one. It's done, so I'm going to check it off my list. The next piece that I need to talk about are angles 1 and 2. Those weren't given to me. I didn't get them directly from the picture. I knew that angles 1 and 2 were congruent due to the fact that angles x and y were given to me to be congruent. So that's where I'm going to go ahead and start. Angle x is congruent to angle y, and I'm really not crazy about them naming these angles with lowercase letters, but since that's what we're told in the given, we're going to go with it. So there's my pair of congruent angles. In order to use the congruent supplements theorem, we also need to have some pairs of supplementary angles. And these are the pieces that I'm going to use the diagram for. We can see in the diagram that angle 1 is supplementary to angle x. We can also see in the diagram that angle 2 is supplementary to angle y. And I can't just say diagram. I have to be specific about what it is in the diagram that makes those guys supplementary. So when I look at the diagram, I see that angles 1 and x form a linear pair, as do angles 2 and y. So I'm going to say linear pairs are supplementary. And now that I've got my congruent angles and I've got my supplementary angles, I'm all set to go ahead and use the congruent supplements theorem. So now I can go ahead and conclude that angles 1 and 2 are congruent. And I can say congruent supplements theorem, I can say congruent angles have congruent supplements, I can say when two angles are congruent, their supplements are congruent. I'm just going to say congruent supplements theorem. But again, the big piece here is that I've already written about congruent angles and I've already written about supplementary angles. Check that off our list. The third pair of congruent parts we need to write about before we can conclude that these triangles are congruent are segments AP and CP. But that's a nice straightforward one right from the givens. Love that. So at this point, we've set ourselves up nicely. We have our first pair of sides, we have our pair of angles, we have our second pair of sides. We can pull those three together, and we can now go ahead and conclude that triangle APB is congruent to triangle CBP. And that we know from our outline is by side angle side. Ooh, that's good stuff. I think we did a pretty good job on that proof. Let's go ahead and let's move on to the next one. In number 2, we're given that angle CDE is congruent to angle CED. So let me move carefully to the picture and find those two angles. We're told that segment AD is congruent to segment BE. And we're told that segment CD is congruent to segment CE. And because we've got lots of triangles running around in this picture, I'm going to get my highlighter out and I'm going to highlight the triangles that we're trying to prove congruent. Triangle ACD, that's that yellow one. We're trying to prove that congruent to triangle BCE. Beautiful. So that gives me a little bit more clear vision exactly which two triangles I want to focus in on here. So when I look at these two triangles, I see, well, I have two pairs of congruent sides. The problem with those red angles is that they're not inside the triangles. However, when I look at their supplementary buddies, the ones that I just marked in blue, their supplementary buddies do live inside the triangles. And so like the first proof, this one too is a side angle side proof. So my first pair of sides are sides AD and BE. The angles, I'm going to name angles 1 and 2. If you want to name those with 3 letters, you're more than welcome. I prefer to name mine with numbers if they haven't already been assigned a name. And then my third pair of sides, segment CD and CE. And now that I've got my outline, I've got my plan, I'm all set to go ahead and to start to write. Notice that two of these pairs of sides were told to me in the givens. And anytime you have two statements that are true for the same reason, remember, we can put them together in our proof. So I'm actually going to start by writing not just about one of those pairs of congruent sides, but about both. And maybe for the sake of our statement and reason people out there, I'll do a statement reason proof this time. Remember, if you're going to use the statement reason proof, you have to have two columns and you have to label the first column as your statements and the second column is your reasons. I think that I feel like that slows me down sometimes, and that's why I tend to prefer the two-column proof. But this is great too. So segment AD is congruent to segment BE, and segment CD is congruent to segment CE. And again, they're both true because they're given to us to be true, and that's why I can put them together into the same statement. And now I have to go through and I have to have this whole discussion of why angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. We knew this because we looked at the first given and we used the picture. So I'm going to go ahead and start by writing about that given. So angle CDE was congruent to angle CED. We knew that was a true statement because it too was a given. I could have actually put that in the first reason or the first statement with those pairs of congruent sides if I had wanted to. And once I had those red angles, then I looked at the picture, and in the picture, I saw that angle 1 was congruent to angle, supplementary to angle CDE. And that angle 2 was supplementary to angle CED. Some of you might be wondering why I didn't use a number for those angles, but those angles were already named for us. So we have to go with the name that's been given to us. So that's kind of a neat little thing to note. So let's see, my reason here is that linear pairs are supplementary. And now that I've established the fact that these angles are congruent and I've talked about their supplements, now I can go ahead and say that angles 1 and 2 are congruent. And that's because of the congruent supplements theorem. Or if you want to say when two angles are congruent, their supplements are congruent, congruent angles have congruent supplements. They're all different ways of saying the exact same thing. But the important thing is that I've talked about those congruent angles and I've talked about the supplementary angles in my previous steps. So I'm going to cite the step where I talked about the congruent angles, statement 2, and the step where I talked about the supplementary angles, statement 3. And at this point, I have my two pairs of sides that I needed. I have my pairs of angles that I needed. Now I'm all set to go ahead and to conclude that those triangles are congruent. So triangle ACD is congruent to triangle BCE, and that we know is by side angle side, the sides coming from statement 1 and the angles from statement 4. Remember that when you write a two-column proof, you need to cite the statements that you're using. When you use a flow proof, I can see what statements you're using because they'll all flow together. But the two-column proof is a little more vague unless you cite. All right, so let's see what you can do when you try out the problem on the next page. And as always, if you have questions, write them down so that you can remember to ask them the next time you come back to class.